Whether you just bought yourself a nice little starter plant from the local nursery or you grew your plants yourself from seed, the prospect of actually getting them into the ground can be a little bit confusing. Seriously, there's a lot more to it than just sticking them into the ground and calling it a day. Okay, that actually does work pretty well. But to do it really well, there are a lot of questions to answer. Things like, how deep do you plant them into the ground? Do they need fertilizer on day one? Do you need to prune them on day one? Do you put an unbroken egg into the planting hole? In fact, there are a ton of little things we can do today on planting day to make sure that these plants not only survive, but thrive and bear a lot of fruit. Strangely enough, none of those things actually involve an egg. Now we've got a ton of tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and tomatillos are ready to go into the ground, so let's do it together. And I know everyone's garden context is a little bit different, so we're gonna do it in two different ways, starting with our container garden and then ending with our main in-ground garden. Let's get started. Actually, scratch that. Two things before we get started. If you did grow your seedlings yourself from seed, they need to be fully hardened off before you plant them out, meaning they need to be fully acclimated to the conditions outdoors before you put them into the ground or into a container. Second, your tomatoes, these guys over here, they don't want to go into the ground until nighttime temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And your peppers and your eggplants, they don't want to go into the ground until nighttime temperatures are consistently above at least 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, now let's get started. Today we're gonna be planting in these three 10-gallon containers, which happens to be the sweet spot for tomatoes and eggplants. For peppers, though, a 10-gallon container is really a little bit too big. You can go all the way down to a 5-gallon bucket, or just do it like me and plant 2 peppers, 1, 2, in each of your 10-gallon containers. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. In terms of this stuff right here, our potting soil for the day, the dirty secret is that any decent quality potting mix is going to work just fine for our nightshades. The one exception is you want to check the back of the bag and look for the ingredients and make sure that the first ingredient is not forest materials. That's like a newer formulation that's often used for very, very cheap potting mixes, and it tends not to work very well for plants like this. Instead, if you want to save some money, I would strongly recommend that you just mix up your own DIY potting mix. It's very, very easy. That's what we pretty much always do. It's what we did for these. I will link to my favorite recipe, a video we made up here, but there are a million other recipes out there and most of them are going to serve you very, very well. Oh, and if you've got some existing containers full of soil already that you'd like to reuse, that is a-okay, great idea. Just go ahead and give it a scoop of fertilizer and then mix it up with like a shovel just to decompact that soil a little bit. You do not need to go out and buy fresh potting soil every time you fill up these containers. No matter what you use though, make sure to leave at least an inch or two here at the top to add some mulch at the end. Now, before we do anything else, it's a really good idea to go ahead and just wet down the soil a little bit. Yes, I am using my favorite Pink Pig watering can, a particular favorite of my toddler. Doing this is not only gonna make it just so much easier to get those seedlings into the ground, it's gonna make it a lot easier to thoroughly wet out the soil and make sure there's not dry pockets. So we're gonna water it down a little bit now, and then we're gonna water it down really thoroughly again at the end. Next up here, I'm just taking 1/3 cup of a granular organic vegetable or tomato fertilizer and gently mixing it into the area where we're actually going to be planting. Now keep in mind that if you were doing 2 plants, like in the case of the peppers, you're probably gonna wanna double that or at least go up to about 1/2 cup. Nothing too fancy to it, just making sure that they've got enough fertilizer in there. Okay, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject. How deeply do we plant our nightshade seedlings? So for tomatoes, there is pretty good academic evidence that at least planting up to the first set of true leaves is going to provide some benefit. It's gonna help that plant establish a thicker set of roots. And there is anecdotal evidence, and certainly this seems to have borne out in my experience, that going even deeper, say up to that second or third set of leaves, even all the way up to the crown, is also beneficial. So I typically recommend planting them about as deep as you are able to, and that seems to work out very well. For eggplants, there doesn't seem to be, or at least none that I can find, any academic evidence indicating that planting deeply is going to benefit you. But there are some trustworthy sources that say you should, that recommend it based on their experience. So what I will normally do is plant them up a little bit if and only if I think they need a little bit more support. Basically, I'll mound them up there if they're looking a little bit floppy. And this guy's looking a little bit floppy because we had a bit of a windstorm yesterday. For peppers, unfortunately, there doesn't really seem to be a plethora of either academic evidence or anecdotal evidence indicating that it's a good idea. And some folks actually have reported having sort of rotting issues because the stem of a pepper is a little bit different. It's a little bit woodier. So I would say go ahead and just keep the soil line where it is. Just match the soil line in your seedling pot to the soil line in your final container or in the ground. To sum up there, plant your tomatoes deep, plant your eggplants as deeply as you would like, and go ahead and match the existing soil line for your peppers. One thing to keep in mind here as we plant in our tomatoes is that you do want to go ahead and remove any of the structures, any of the leafing stems here that are going to end up underground, just because those can rot if you leave them in place, so it's better to remove them. And you can see here, I'm going to get this guy in very nice and deep. Let's see if we can get it centered a little bit more. There we go. Beautiful. One thing to keep in mind with peppers is they tend to have slightly more sensitive roots than our other two plants. So just try and be as gentle as you can be when you transplant them. It's better if they've got a pretty established root system, because that way all that soil and root ball will kind of stay in place. But that one seemed to do pretty nicely. And in all cases, we do want to make sure that we are firmly pressing down just to remove any air pockets we introduced when we were creating that planting hole. With our plants in the ground, it is a superb idea to go ahead and get them some form of support, some trellis in place. You can wait when they're still this small a couple of weeks if you want, but I strongly suggest that you just go ahead and do it right away. Ask me how I know. So for container tomatoes, my favorite option is the Florida weave, where you take 2 stakes on either side of a row of containers, and then you basket weave between the plants in those stakes in order to create a nice, super easy structure that will hold them in place. Full video on how to do that right here. The downside with a Florida weave system is that you lose the mobility inherent to these containers. So today we're gonna go with my second favorite option, which is a really freaking large stake, not exactly high tech. So basically what I'm gonna do is go ahead and put this stake in about 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches behind the plant. We just want to make sure that we are not puncturing its roots, so just kind of eyeball it, make sure that you are as far behind the plant as that root ball would have extended, and we're just going to stick it into the ground there. Making sure that it is going all the way down to the bottom. We want that to be as sturdy as humanly possible. Once that is in place, we are just going to take a length of twine. For this purpose, you can really just use any super simple, cheap jute twine and tie off that tomato to the stake. Now, you may notice that as I do this, the tomato is going to kind of be pulled over a little bit. It's going to kind of flop over. That's totally fine. Over the next couple of days, it's going to reach for the sun and it's going to straighten up. The benefit of getting the support from the stake is vastly outweighing any damage that is caused by it kind of bending over a little bit. And then we'll do this a few more times, obviously, as that plant grows up that stake. And this tomato will get actually even larger than this 5-foot furring strip right here. They get really tall, these indeterminate tomato plants. In case you are wondering, yes, I did just plant a second pepper plant as previously promised that I forgot when we did the first one. Okay, now that we're talking about pepper plants, let's go ahead and stake these up. For our peppers and eggplants, we don't need to use anywhere near so large of a stake. 18 inches to 24 inches is going to be more than enough. So same idea here. We're just going to place it behind the plant's root system, making sure we're going all the way down there. And then we are going to tie a section of jute twine to the stake and to the pepper plant just to hold that in place. All there is to it. You remembered to leave some room for mulch at the top of the bag, right? Good, because when the summer kicks into full gear, these bags are gonna dry out super fast without some of this good stuff. By the way, if you don't have access to wood chip mulch like this, grass clippings or even straw can work really well as well. Now, as promised, we're going to go ahead and give these another nice big drink of water, not only to help make sure that the plants don't suffer too much transplant shock from, being put into a whole new location, but also just to help remove any air pockets that we may have introduced as we were kind of stirring up that soil. I will, of course, be using my toddler's trusty pink pig container. That is a pretty happy plant. Nice work, good job. Now let's go ahead and get them into the sun where they want to be. So realistically, all of our nightshades would really prefer to be in a full sun location with at least 8 hours of sun. Even more than that, better. But if you can't give them that, don't worry, neither can I. Some plants that have done really well for me in partial shade locations, say 5 or 6 hours, are things like cherry tomatoes, specifically the black cherry variety of cherry tomatoes really seem to do well in the shade, as well as hot peppers, specifically hot Thai chilies have done really well for me in the shade. So I would say try and prioritize giving things like your eggplants and your slicer tomatoes those sunnier positions, and maybe give those hot peppers and cherry tomatoes those slightly shadier positions. All right, these guys look absolutely awesome. I think our work here is done, which means it is time to get over to the main garden and start planting in the ground. But before we do that, I have a little bit of a request to make. If you have enjoyed this video, if you think you are learning something, would you mind hitting the like button for me? Makes all the difference in the world. It is just tremendously helpful to us. I really, truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching the video. Let's get back to the plantings. Okay, y'all, let's talk about prep, because there is a little bit more to do with our in-ground garden than there was with those container plantings. And the first thing that I need to do is just get rid of all of the old plants that were left over from our spring and fall plantings to make way for the new. Now I'm just broadcasting on some organic granular veggie fertilizer to the row as a whole, not in any one specific location, just trying to replace any lost nutrients from that last round of plants that we just took out. Next up, it's time to take my trusty garden fork here and just gently aerate and decompact the row. Try and keep in mind that the plants that we are planting today have really deep root systems, and those roots are going to need access to oxygen, and over time the soil becomes more and more compact. So a little light forking really does wonders to make sure that those roots are able to grow in a healthy manner. Finally, it is always a good idea to add a thin layer of aged compost or manure like this stuff right here, just to make sure that you are leaving that soil even better than you found it, and then just go ahead and rake the whole area smooth, and that's it. So the biggest difference out here in the garden compared to those containers we just planted is the spacing, because we have lots of space to work with out here, and therefore you've got a lot of options about how you want to space out your plants. But what I do, and what I recommend, is doing almost everything on 1 foot intervals. Your peppers, your eggplants, your tomatillos, your slicer tomatoes, your beefsteak tomatoes, your paste tomatoes, basically everything but cherry tomatoes, and we'll go to those in a second, on 1 foot spacing. But it's really important to keep in mind that that 12-inch spacing I'm recommending only works if you're keeping all of your tomatoes, your paste tomatoes, your beefsteaks, your slicers, what have you, to a single liter, 1 liter, 1 vine. Basically, you are removing all of the suckers. If you do that, you can really smash them in there nice and tight every 1 foot, and they'll grow beautifully. Now, cherry tomatoes are a little bit different. Our cherry tomatoes are going to get 18 inches of space, or 1.5 feet. And the reason is cherry tomatoes tend to do best with a double leader system. So rather than just keeping the main growing vine in place, we're going to keep that main growing vine plus 1 sucker, specifically this sucker that is located right beneath the first flowering truss. So we're going to have this main growing vine, and then this sucker right here actually producing fruit. And that's called a double leader system, or a strong Y system. If you want way more information on how to achieve that, how to prune your cherry tomatoes, I've got a video on that up here you can check out. I should also mention that we don't grow any determinate tomato plants. So if you are growing determinants, they're also a little bit different. You're going to want to go ahead and give them at least 18 inches of space, maybe 24 inches of space. And that's because you don't remove any suckers from those suckers. You just let them grow out into a nice big bush, and therefore their growth habits are very, very different, much wider, and they need a lot more space. All right, what do you say we get these suckers in the ground? Right now I'm just getting each of those planting holes started at about 1 foot spacing, and then I'm coming back down the row here, and I am adding in about a 1/4 cup of organic granular fertilizer into each one of those planting holes, and just gently mixing in that fertilizer into the planting hole so there's not just a big clump of it right at the bottom. As you can see here, exact same as before, I'm really working to get this tomato in there nice and deep, give it the best chance of success. That was a lot of planting. Let's talk a little bit about trellising now. So all of our eggplants and peppers and tomatillos out here in the row garden do really well with a style of trellising called the Florida weave. And I like it because it is super cheap and super easy. All I'm gonna need to do that is a few stakes. These are 24-inch sections of furring strips, some poly twine right here, a hammer to jam those stakes into the ground, and then some scissors to get the twine the length we need it. Let me show you how to do it on the tomatillos right now. system, right? I really like how it works for smaller, more compact plants in the in-ground garden, things like peppers and tomatillos. But for our tomatoes this year, we're gonna go with an overhead crossbar system. Actually, I made an entire video on this if you want to check it out. But the gist of it here is I'm taking a string and tying it around the base of the tomato plant and then wrapping it around that central leader a couple of times and then bringing the string all the way up to a crossbar about 7 feet off the ground and then just tightly tying it to that crossbar. Then over time, I can just come in here and gently train that tomato leader around that string all the way up to the top. Just keep in mind that you need one string for each leader. So most of our tomatoes only need one string, but our cherry tomatoes, where we're doing a double leader, are gonna need 2 strings per plant. Okay, they are fertilized, they are planted, they are trellised. Next up, we need to talk a little bit about mulch. Right now, the mulch I'm using is actually that compost that we laid out. We did it so thickly that it actually helps to prevent weeds and help keep moisture in that soil. More importantly, this really dark style of mulch, this compost, helps warm up the soil a little bit faster, which is really nice in these early days of spring when nighttime temperatures can be a little bit cooler than our plants actually want them. Then later in the season, when things kind of get too hot for our plants, we can bring in a lighter mulch, specifically my favorite type of mulch, wood chips. Can you believe we are almost done here? Same as before, these plants are gonna go through much less transplant shock. They'll be much happier if we can give them a nice big drink of water before we walk away from the garden. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn on our irrigation and let them rip. But obviously if you're using a hose, that'll work great. Just try and put the hose on sort of a low setting or a low flow setting and keep it on for a longer period of time. A little bit of water over a longer period of time does a better job of penetrating down deep into the dirt. Now, if you're anything like me, you're already thinking about the next task that needs doing in the garden. So I'm gonna go ahead and link to a few videos we did on pruning your peppers and your eggplants and your cherry tomatoes up here somewhere. I will link those as well as put them down in the description. Otherwise, that's it for today. Happy gardening, y'all, and I really hope to see you on the next one.